And so in this video, we are going to talk about population density, the three main types of population density. Lots of graphs, lots of things to look at when we talk about population density. So specifically the definition of one of the three types of population, arithmetic density, is the total number of inhabitants in an area divided by total land area. So basically when people say population density, they refer to arithmetic density for the most part. Kind of in layman's term or in simple terms, it's the total population divided by land, usually square kilometers, or in the United States, square mile, because we use the metric system. But you can see on the right-hand side just how much the US has grown in terms of average total number of inhabitants per square mile throughout the years. So this is the United States in its infancy, 4.5. And this is what the United States looks roughly like today, where we have about 92.9 residents per square mile. So people, you take the total number of people and you divide it by the total number of land, and you get arithmetic density. All right, and on a global scale, this is a map of population density throughout the world. So some examples of countries that would have really, really high population density looking at this would be Bangladesh here, South Korea, the Netherlands. So any place, kind of smaller countries are slightly more likely to have higher population densities, given that they have a smaller denominator. And on the other side of the coin, larger countries like Canada, Russia, Australia have generally low population densities as they have a smaller population and more geographic territory. And if we change the scale even more, we look inside of Mexico, and you can see population density is interesting to look at on the sort of national scale in terms of the scale of analysis of this map. But it's also interesting to zoom in and look at different scales of analysis within a country. So we can see kind of where population density exists within Mexico. You have lots and lots and lots of population density in and around Mexico City. Some other big cities, Guadalajara and Tijuana and Monterrey. But you also have lots of parts of Mexico that have really, really low levels of population density. So when we zoom in, when we change the scale of analysis, that gives us a more accurate look at population density. And I just like this. This is an old map of population density from the Soviet Union, like 1925. But occasionally when we find pretty maps, we'll include them. You can see Russia's population density probably still looks much like this today, where you have much of its population in the kind of European part of Russia, as opposed to the Siberian or Asian part of Russia. But just a cool map. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is going to go with the final two types of population density. So it is the term arable land. So we're going to add this in. Arable land is defined as any land capable of being plowed or used to grow crops. So arable land is going to be important because in the next two types of population density, we are going to be looking at population kind of divided by arable land. So the purpose of this is to look at a country's basically look at a country's food production and look at a country's ability to provide for itself, and thinking about what kind of what the implications economically speaking, geographically speaking, environmentally speaking might be for a country. So any land capable of being plowed or used to grow crops. So a few interesting graphics down at the bottom. The United States leads the world in the total amount of arable land, kind of closely followed by India. You can see Russia, China, Brazil. So not surprisingly, in this measurement, larger countries are more likely to have more arable land. And interestingly enough, the other graphic shows us the countries kind of with the most percentage of arable land. So you can see Bangladesh, number 1, the Ukraine, Denmark, number 3. So kind of an interesting look at countries that have a larger percentage of its land being arable. All right, so where arable land becomes important is looking at physiological density. So instead of kind of total number of inhabitants by land, this definition for physiological density is total number of inhabitants in area divided by arable land. So the United States, if you remember, had 92 people per square mile as its population density, or its arithmetic density. Physiological density is 380 people per square mile. So here is a look at physiological density. So you can see a country that has a high example of physiological density would be India, Bangladesh, Vietnam. Countries with relatively low physiological densities, again, would be, geographically speaking, kind of more likely to be larger. And you also have lots of other things that come into play, like the climate and the geography, the kind of the physical characteristics, the site itself, right? So you have some places that have lots of arable land and some places that do not have as much arable land. All right, so the last type that we are going to talk about, and this is a type of population density, but it doesn't actually have to do that much with the study of population. So it is called a country's agricultural density, meaning the ratio of the number of farmers to the amount of arable land. So because it doesn't have that much to do with population because not every country has equal amounts of farmers. So it's more used as a measure of development and efficiency in food production. So as a general rule, countries that are more developed are going to have much smaller percentage of its workforce engaged in farming. And countries that are less developed have a lot more farmers. So what this statistic actually does is it tells us a lot about the country's level of development, because countries with high agricultural densities are likely to be less developed because they have more people engaged in agriculture. So essentially the denominator, the numerator is bigger, right? So if we look at countries with high agricultural densities, we see kind of a combination of less developed countries. So most countries in sub-Saharan Africa have lower levels of development and lower, kind of higher agricultural densities. And we also see countries that have small geographic territory and lots of people, because so Southeast Asia, most of that region has a high agricultural density. China, India, so you still see kind of large amounts of people that are engaged in farming in those countries as well. So agricultural density doesn't tell us a ton about population as much as it tells about development. So, and just to kind of go a little bit more into this, this is a listing of a total amount of each country that's engaged in agriculture. So kind of the percent of the workforce that's engaged in agriculture. So a country like India has around 15%, Egypt around 11%. So those countries would both be considered developing countries, basically, kind of in that middle range of newly industrializing or developing countries. Mexico would fit into that category as well. Japan, the United States would be considered more developed countries. And not surprisingly, we see really low percentages of people engaged in agriculture. And on the flip side, a country like Chad, which is one of the least developed countries in the world, has 80% of its workforce engaged in agriculture, thus kind of giving us a high agricultural density. Even though Chad right here isn't in the highest category, probably because it's large size and relatively low population. So this measure is actually really interesting, but not that interesting in the sense of population as much as it is in agriculture and kind of carrying capacity and things like that. Okay.